Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Hudson Library and Historical Society. We're so glad to have you here this evening for our final program in the Tudor month that we put on. Join us next month. We're doing a tour of Egypt, which will include, even have the wrong introduction. Oh, great. You might have to introduce yourself, Reggie. Which will include 2 virtual tours, one of the Great Pyramids, one of Luxor. We've got an archaeologist talking about Cleopatra, and then we have a historian who's talking about the Battle of Actium. So should be very exciting, so join us for that. After this talk, we will have a short reception with refreshments and coffee. So feel free to stay for that. You can ask Reggie some of your additional burning questions. I'm really pleased to introduce Reggie Musnuff. He is a 2014 graduate of Hudson High School, so he's a Hudson resident, or former Hudson resident. And he graduated with his bachelor's degree in history from Ohio University and his master's University of Chicago, also in history, but with a focus on Elizabethan England. And you'll get more into that. That was off memory right there. So, whoo. Okay, so without further ado, Reggie Musnuff.
All right. Well, fortunately, my resume is still rather brief. So, University of Chicago and OU, that's sufficient. That'll do it. That's perfect. So, my friends, thank you all so much for being here. I'd like to thank the Hudson Library for having me. Though, now that I have you all in front of me, I must say I'm a little confused why the whole year hasn't been dedicated to the Tudors. I'm sure Egypt sounds fascinating, but it's one man's opinion. So, I hope by now that some of you have had a chance to visit the exhibit that's at the Cleveland Museum of Art that is on the Tudors. I think it's there through May 14th, if memory serves, if we haven't been there yet. It is absolutely breathtaking to see the way in which this monarchy, which spanned from 1485 to 1603, marketed itself as the kings and queens of England. And almost every piece in this exhibit shares really one common expression or one common through line, and that would be power. So, we, the viewer, are reminded at basically every turn of the power and the majesty that the Tudors reigned with. And we can be sure that viewers in the 16th century would have felt exactly the same way. That was, after all, the point. But we're asking a somewhat of a different question than the Art Museum today. The Art Museum's exhibit is concerned with how the Tudors propagandized. We are concerned with why. Why was it that this dynasty felt it so necessary to market its power as aggressively as it did? Now, all monarchs in early modern England, well, early modern Europe, used the patronage of art to market their authority. So in a sense, we could say that they're really just following suit. And in a sense, this has a kernel of truth to it, but it's insufficient. I think there's a deeper answer. I think the Tudors, especially Elizabeth I, marketed themselves the way that they did because of basically vulnerability, or we could say insecurity. We tend to forget just how vulnerable England, especially Elizabethan England, was in the late 15th century. How much more powerful its French and Spanish neighbors were, how easily it seemed that the Church of England might be abolished should Elizabeth fall to one of its Catholic neighbors. This scenario seemed very real to the people in this day, and it was the object of many plots that we will explore tonight. So, we are going to follow the action of Elizabeth's most committed enemies as well as her most committed champions through a period mostly through 1583 and 1587. And we will explore why it was that the Elizabethan regime felt so vulnerable. So, let's go over a little bit of the background information that we will need. First, what were the factors that made the Tudors so insecure? Well, first and foremost, they had a relatively weak claim to the throne. Very, very briefly, in the 15th century, the houses of Lancaster and York had pitted themselves in this dynastic war as the War of the Roses. Oh, do I need to turn this up just a bit? Oh, sure, absolutely. I'm sorry, my friends. Am I audible to everybody? Okay, fantastic. My apologies. So, the 15th century, War of the Roses, houses of Lancaster, houses of York, fighting each other for dynastic control. Anybody has ever seen Game of Thrones? If this sounds familiar, absolutely the origin of where they get that story. So, why is this important for us? Henry Tudor, the person on the left here, is basically the last best noble standing with the best claim. He defeats Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485 and takes the throne. So the Tudors, in a sense, were usurpers themselves. Everybody in Europe was well aware of this, including the Tudors. Why could they then not be usurped? This was a lingering question in everybody's mind. So, let's see. Second would be the Protestant Reformation. Now, again, these are enormous things that we're talking about very briefly. We could spend months talking about the Protestant Reformation in its own right. But for our purposes, it's important for us to remember that belief in this time period, religious belief in this time period, came with a conviction that we might not appreciate in our modern world. And for the first time, especially because of the Protestant Reformation, Europeans were faced with a choice between what the correct form, the correct mode of faith was. The wrong answer to this question, they believed, would land you in hell forever. So this was something that really mattered, not only to kings and queens, but to everybody, from nobles to commons. So, let's also keep in mind that the English Reformation was particularly turbulent. Starting in 1534 with Henry VIII, Elizabeth's father, England had gone from Catholicism to Protestantism, back to Catholicism, and then back to Protestantism again. This is all in the span of 30 years. So again, in this time period where things really mattered, this was an incredibly turbulent turn of events. Elizabeth inherited this turbulence. And being the pragmatist that she was, she attempted to address the religious divide at the very beginning of her reign. So in 1559, she struck the religious settlement, which was remarkably neutral. It's sort of like a Lutheran light theology with like the elements of Catholic Mass still there, like the ritual and ceremony. And as we might expect from a dead middle neutral option, both sides really disliked it. Especially those hotter sorts of Protestants that we would call Puritans, but also, for our purposes, Catholics. Catholic Mass was basically driven underground. The means of worship for Catholicism were outlawed, so Catholics were particularly disgruntled by this. So, and it is at the intersection of these first two factors that we are going to meet the biggest threat to the Elizabethan regime. This singular person, Mary, Queen of Scots, Mary Stuart. So, why is Mary Stuart so dangerous to the Elizabethan regime? What's the problem here? Well, first and foremost, she is Elizabeth's cousin. She is the great-granddaughter of Henry VII, which means that her claim to the throne is just about as good as Elizabeth's. So she's a rival claimant, and not only is she a rival claimant, she is a Catholic. She is a very devoted Catholic who has very powerful and very aggressive Catholic allies and family members on the continent. Someone like the Duke of Guise. Now, I'm throwing this name out now because he'll become important later. So Mary was obviously Queen of Scots, though she had been ousted from power in Scotland around 1567. She fled to England and was living virtually under house arrest, but her very existence was provocative. If she could somehow just replace Elizabeth as queen, Catholicism would be restored. Protestantism would be abolished. Catholics and Protestants were very well aware of this fact, and it whetted the appetites of some while really concerning others. So, now that we have met Mary, Queen of Scots, the chief, I guess we could say, threat that we'll face today, let's introduce her principal antagonist. This man, Sir Francis Walsingham. So, he is basically the main character at the heart of our story tonight. As I said, and he was probably Mary, Queen of Scots' most committed antagonist, her biggest enemy. Walsingham would serve as Elizabeth's principal secretary from 1572 to 1590, and this is basically the equivalent of like a modern Secretary of State. He was a zealous supporter of the Protestant cause whose main drive throughout his entire career was the preservation of a Protestant England, basically keeping England from reverting back to Catholicism. And in reality, this meant keeping Mary Stuart from the throne. So, the means by which he would succeed were espionage. As principal secretary, Walsingham organized an extensive network of spies ranging from London to Istanbul, Algiers to Moscow. And this network of spies was not only organized by Walsingham, but it was also paid for by him, almost entirely by him, out of his own personal income rather than government funds. So why do this? Why would he spend all this money? He died in 1590 in almost 40,000 pounds worth of debt to the crown. So what's the point? Why would he do something like this out of his own dollar? So in a word, it really was his religious convictions. He thought that the preservation of Protestant England was of paramount importance. And beginning in 1570, there were two main events that really sharpened his ferocity. And this is where our story really begins in earnest. So, in February of 1570, Pope Pius V, upon hearing rumors of a Catholic uprising in northern England, took an aggressive course of action which was aimed to instigate further rebellion. He excommunicated Elizabeth via this document here, a papal bull called Regnans and Excelsis, or ruling in exile for those of us who are not super up to date with our Latin. So, this title basically described what the Vatican's position was on Elizabeth as a ruler. She was referred to as, quote, the pretended Queen of England, the servant of crime who had reduced a once proud Catholic country to a miserable ruin. Pius declared Elizabeth an illegitimate monarch. He relieved all subjects who had sworn oaths to her of their duty. And finally, and most damning, Pius demanded that the people of England, quote, dare not obey her orders, mandates, or laws, adding that, quote, those who shall act to the contrary, we include in the sentence of excommunication. No more sacraments, no more mass, no final rites, no Eucharist, nothing. This is what excommunication meant to Catholics. This is the ultimatum that the Pope gave to Elizabeth's subjects. You could choose between her as your queen or Catholicism, but you could not do both. Those terms to Pius V were mutually exclusive. Now, it should be said that basically the majority of Catholics that were living in England completely ignored this. They did not feel the need to actually address and live under these circumstances. But it gave people like Walsingham a perpetual suspicion that Catholics couldn't be trusted and that their motives were inherently seditious. And that brings us to the second main event we'll talk about, which is the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. Now, as I said, Walsingham acted as principal secretary, and this came with a lot of overseas appointments. So in Paris, in 1572, he was stationed as the ambassador to the French court there. And it is in Paris that he witnessed certainly one of the bloodiest days in French history, singular days, which is saying a lot given the French Revolution that would come a few years later. So, on August 24th, 1572, there was this enormous uprising of French Catholics in Paris. They assassinated the leader of the French Protestant cause, and they took to the streets, massacring civilians by the thousands. This is actually, kind of interestingly, the point in history where the word massacre is first used to describe a human atrocity. Previously to this point, the term massacre had only been used to describe the piece of wood that butchers would use to carve apart animals. So that might tell us something about the violence that was witnessed on this day. So by August 27th, it's estimated that over 3,000 Protestants had been butchered in this manner. All Walsingham could do was hide out in his embassy, pray that his diplomatic immunity would hold, and consider the future. This, he thought, was what he must avoid. This is what he thought would happen if Catholicism would return to England. This is why he had to keep Mary Stuart from the throne. So this, with our background set, will take us to the first major crisis that we'll investigate tonight. This thing called the Throckmorton Plot. Maybe some of us have heard of this before. So in the time between St. Bartholomew's Day in 1572 and the Throckmorton Plot of 1583, Walsingham's spies were busy at work, writing diligently to the master secretary about any rumor that they heard, whether it was true or false. Walsingham was a man who was very comfortable with processing rumors, flushing out fact from fiction later. Rumors were as valuable as facts to this man. So in January of 1582, a spy named Barnard relayed a disturbing rumor that he had heard in Staffordshire. Underground Catholics, he reported, were buzzing with talk of foreign invasion supported by domestic rebellion. Walsingham, troubled by these rumors, doubled the efforts of his informants, and soon they would discover this plot, the Throckmorton Plot. So, picture for me, if you will, August of 1583, early in the morning of a very choppy day on the English Channel. A shipmaster and expert smuggler named John Halter is escorting an anonymous man across the English Channel. This man stayed in England for about a month, and after a month he fled back into France. His name was Charles Paget. He was an underground Catholic in exile, and he was acting as a scout for an invasion. He had come to England to test the waters of certain havens to see which would be best for landing. And this was the first step of the Throckmorton Plot. So what is this plot? What was the effort? Well, first of all, the Duke of Guise, this man on the left, and I remind you, Mary Stuart's cousin, would lead a French invasion that would land in the south. At the same time, men like Paget would start a rebellion in the north of underground Catholics, thus dividing the Elizabethan government on two fronts. All of this entire enterprise had the funding of two people in the middle and the right, Philip II of Spain and Pope Gregory XIII. So there was one final component to the Throckmorton Plot, and that was the release of Mary, Queen of Scots, and her usurpation of Elizabeth. And this is where Francis Throckmorton, the plot's namesake, comes into the picture. So Throckmorton was the eldest son of a disgraced and really financially ruined Catholic family. Between 1580 and 1583, he traveled through Catholic Europe, mainly in Rome and Paris, and sometime during this journey, he was introduced to a man named Thomas Morgan. Thomas Morgan was essentially Mary, Queen of Scots' version of Walsingham. He was her principal secretary, her chief spy, we could say, her intelligencer, her scribe. So, Throckmorton and Morgan must have made some sort of really strong connection between each other, because when Throckmorton came back to England in 1583, he was acting as a courier between Mary Stuart, the French embassy, and Thomas Morgan in Paris. Through Throckmorton, Mary could receive news of secretly formed plots and outside information, which she formerly did not have. So careful as Throckmorton and his conspirators were, they really could not have been careful enough. Walsingham's spies were everywhere. They had already grown suspicious of Morgan's role in Paris, and thus when Throckmorton began associating with him, they became suspicious of him as well. They began to monitor Throckmorton throughout his visit, and when he returned to England, he was almost immediately arrested. So Walsingham agents caught him literally in his house when they arrested him in the middle of writing a letter to Mary Stuart. They found no letters from Mary herself, but what they found was shocking. Along with this letter telling her of the plan that they had laid, they found a list of Catholic nobles who they thought could be incited against Elizabeth. They found an ancient pedigree which showed visually Mary's claim to the throne, and they found a list of havens where ships would be landed for an invasion. If Walsingham had only been suspicious, he now had proof that Throckmorton was involved in some sort of conspiratorial plot. But who was he working with? There were so many lingering questions that needed answers, and there was only, in his mind, one way to get them. So, I actually appreciate that this is a rather comic image now, because I must say it is rather, it's a little funny to look at now, but we should keep in mind this was probably excruciating. So this is an image of the rack that we might call it kind of colloquially. I don't want to linger too much on how the rack would have been used, because I think some of us maybe had dinner pretty recently, and I don't want to see that anywhere. So the only course of action I said now for Throckmorton was to be interrogated. So on December 4th, after weeks of twist after twist, bone-breaking pain, tendon snapping on the rack, he finally confessed. He confessed that part of his plan would involve an invasion with the Duke of Guise. He confessed that the King of Spain had been funding this venture. He confessed that the Spanish ambassador had been involved in the plot. He told them everything. And all of a sudden, Walsingham had confirmation that his biggest fears of a grand Catholic conspiracy were real. Throckmorton was tried, hanged, drawn, and quartered on July 20th of 1584. That I will not show you a picture of because it is worse than this. So what were the effects of the Throckmorton plot on the political scene? Well, for one thing, it completely deteriorated an already fractured Anglo-Spanish relationship. Out the door, gone, can't be refigured. It also confirmed beyond a reasonable doubt that some of the continent's most powerful Catholic rulers, like the King of Spain, the Pope, had been, and likely still were, plotting to overthrow Elizabeth. It also informed them yet again that even after all these years of house arrest, Mary Queen of Scots was still the focal point of rebellion. Third, and maybe most importantly, and probably most disturbingly, the Privy Council, Walsingham and his colleagues reflected on how inadequately this plot had been punished. Of all the people involved, only Throckmorton had been killed, and he was just a courier. The architects of this plan were all very much alive still, and all lodging now in Paris together, which is really the focal point of anti-Elizabethan scheming. So this worried Walsingham. He had to be ready. And that brings us to a brief interlude where we will talk about two acts of parliament that were actually passed in this time period. So in October of 1584, 2 months after Throckmorton's execution, Walsingham and Elizabeth's principal advisor, William Cecil, met the other members of Elizabeth's Privy Council at Hampton Court Palace. They were gathered to discuss these pieces of legislation. This first one we'll talk about is called the Bond of Association. So this was basically their formal response to the plot that they had just seen. The signatories of this bond were united around a sworn oath. They promised, quote, before the majesty of Almighty God, that they would pursue by force of arms, as by any other means of revenge, any person who sought to usurp Elizabeth with a pretended successor, as well as anybody who aided and abetted these schemes. This was a remarkable document, and it was signed by all the privy councilors present, but it was also circulated through the entire kingdom, getting as far away as Northumberland, collecting thousands of signatures from people of all societal ranks. The Queen herself, obviously, nobles, but even commoners signed a document like this. And very importantly, Walsingham forced Mary Stuart to sign this document. So, in 1585, Parliament passed the second act that we see here, the Act for the Queen's Surety. And this basically put the Bond of Association formally into law, but it actually raised the stakes somewhat significantly. So, if Elizabeth, this act stated, were to be assassinated or usurped, the power of the government would pass into the hands of 24 of Elizabeth's privy councilors. They would act as a commission. They would sit in judgment of those who had been involved in any sort of treacherous plot, and they would use all their power and any means necessary to bring this person to justice, effectively to kill them. Now, I admit legal history can be a bit dense at times. I say that with a lawyer of a father in the room. I'm very sorry. But most of the time it can be cool. Sometimes it's cool. But there are two seriously significant implications that were introduced by the legislation of 1584 and 1585. The first was, in the event of Elizabeth's usurpation or murder, the Privy Council retained the power to try these people to death. This was essentially just licensed revenge, pure and simple, nothing more than that, and it was entirely aimed at Mary Stuart. Second, but maybe more interestingly, the power of the government would stay in the hands of Elizabeth's council if she was killed. Now, why is that important? We have to remember that in a monarchy, an early modern monarchy like England, there is no government without a monarch. Everything in the country stems from their royal authority. including the appointment of offices. So if a monarch is removed or dies, there is no Privy Council. It dissolves. That was until this bill was introduced. In the event of Elizabeth's assassination, a sort of mini republic would be formed in her name. This was Walsingham's answer, this sort of interregnum between monarchies. And we have to appreciate how significant of an event this is to propose that a sort of miniature republic would be formed in the absence of a monarchy at this time period. This might be inspiring to those of us who live in a republic today, but this was really a move more of desperation. This was how far they were willing to come to keep Mary Stuart from the throne, and this is how close they thought that she was getting. But Walsingham knew that obstacles were opportunities, and in this opportunity, he laid a trap, and he had forced Mary to sign it. Which brings us to the second major boiling point of tonight, the Babington Plot, even more important than the second. All these fun plots. I hope not to have a plot named after me like this for what happens to these people, but even so, it's kind of fun. So, as it turns out, Walsingham's suspicions about another future plot were completely right. The former architects of the Throckmorton Plot began reorganizing their efforts almost immediately, and they had used their failed plan basically as a template. And this brings us to the Babington Plot. So, the narrative of this event again begins with Thomas Morgan in Paris, and as a reminder, this is the person who was Mary, Queen of Scots, basically her chief intelligencer, her scribe, her secretary, we would say. And it was while Morgan was in Paris again that he recruited another English Catholic gentleman to be courier for Mary Stuart in England. This again was basically the same role that Throckmorton had played. This man's name was Gilbert Giffard, and he'll be very important for the story to come. So Giffard, like Throckmorton before him, was an exiled Catholic who was falling on hard times financially. Around 1580, like Throckmorton, it is believed that he left England and was traveling abroad in Europe, hanging around Catholic universities and with Jesuits mostly. And it is probably through these connections that he met Thomas Morgan. So, in October of 1585, Morgan and Giffard met for the first time in Paris. Morgan was intrigued by Giffard because he had a rather natural proficiency for languages, which is a pretty useful skill for somebody who hoped to be an informer. But Giffard had also been a friend of Francis Throckmorton, and for that reason, Morgan felt that he could really trust him. But just like before, Walsingham spies were already busy. An informant named Nicholas Burden this time grew suspicious of Giffard and his growing association with Thomas Morgan. He told Walsingham in 1585 that soon Giffard would be leaving from Paris to London. Walsingham sensed an opportunity and loaded all the ports that he could possibly land at with spies waiting to apprehend him. So in December of 1585, immediately upon his arrival at the port in Rye, Giffard was apprehended and immediately taken to be interrogated by Walsingham personally. Back in Paris, Thomas Morgan grew very worried. He heard news that Giffard had been apprehended, but he had no idea what the outcome was. Would his cover hold? Would he reveal everything before their plot even started? For days, he waited. And finally, he heard word that Giffard had been released. He breathed a sigh of relief. But this was only a half-truth. Giffard had been released, but only because Walsingham had converted him. He would be working as a double agent now, and he would continue to serve in his role as Mary, Queen of Scots' courier. So any messages that Morgan thought he was secretly sending to Mary, he was sending to Walsingham. So he served this role as a double agent for many months until in July of 1586, he met a very crucial player to come, and this man's name was John Ballard. Now, I have to give a brief interlude here and say there's a movie about Elizabeth that came out in 2007, and John Ballard is actually played by Daniel Craig, which I find so funny because that's James Bond, and this is like an Elizabethan spy story, right? So he unfortunately is on the other end of things, poor James Bond in early modern England. So, who was Ballard? Ballard was a Jesuit priest who considered it really his duty to restore his once Catholic home to the Catholic fold. Ballard had heard upon rumor that Giffard had been acting as Mary Stuart's courier, and he was frustrated. He too had been sent by Morgan to England, and his role was to sow the seeds of rebellion until he got further instruction from Paris. But he had heard nothing up to July of 1586. Frustrated by this lack of information, Ballard asked Gifford if he had heard anything from Morgan. If, Ballard said, he didn't receive news soon, he feared that all his preparatory work would have gone in vain. Gifford froze. What did he mean, preparatory work? What was he talking about? He told Gifford that he had already enlisted the help of several Catholic noblemen that would help to assassinate Elizabeth. Gifford needed to hear more. He resisted the urge to press for names, but hoped that in time Ballard would reveal something to them. And he actually did much better than that. Ballard asked Gifford to give Mary, Queen of Scots, a letter from one of his associates who he had recruited, this man, Anthony Babington, the plot's namesake. So Babington's letter to the Queen of Scots was extraordinary. He expounded the entirety of their plan, which he and his associates had laid, and it was essentially the Throckmorton Plot 2.0. Catholic princes would invade, the Pope would pay for everything, and Mary would be freed, and Elizabeth would be killed. Not just usurped this time, killed. When Gifford passed this news on to Walsingham, he had a difficult decision to make. Obviously, arresting Ballard and Babington would be the safest thing to do, but, he thought, if he would just let events take their course a bit further, maybe Mary Stuart would incriminate herself. Maybe this was his chance to trap her and finally kill her. So, Walsingham decided to take the risk. He made a copy of Babington's letter, and he sent the original on to Mary Stuart via Gifford. He would repeat this process in reverse to capture Mary's answer. And Mary's answer is known to us today as the Bloody Letter, rather ominously foreshadowing. So, Mary was far too intelligent to just fall right into the trap of recognizing the plot outright. Doing that would obviously give anyone just cause to kill her, following the legislation of 1584. Her response was vague and undirected, asking only one question, quote, "By what means do these 6 gentlemen deliberate to proceed?" Walsingham thought that Mary had been inquisitive of a plot, but she had not endorsed it. He was close, but not quite there yet. But time was ticking. He was growing desperate. Every minute that he waited, this plot got closer and closer to actually taking place. He had to do something desperate, something bold. He resorted to forgery. He figured that if he fabricated Mary's response, if he fabricated Mary's endorsement of the plot, he could trick the conspirators into acting more rashly with a sense of false confidence. Walsingham added a postscript to Mary's letter, which read, quote, "I would be glad to know the names and qualities of the 6 gentlemen which are to accomplish the designment, for that it may be I shall be able, upon knowledge of the parties, to give you some further advice necessary to be followed." Now, what does that mean in our modern speak? Well, this just means that Walsingham was basically impersonating Mary, giving her approval and offering her help. Complicit. So Walsingham cast his die, and eventually his plan worked. Ballard and Babington began to move more openly, and on August 4th, after weeks of constant surveillance, John Ballard was arrested. Babington, however, heard news of his arrest beforehand, and he fled. The Elizabethan regime launched an all-out manhunt. One witness remarked, quote, "All ways were watched, infinite houses searched, hues and cries raised, frights brooded in the people's ears, and all men's eyes filled with smoke, as though the whole realm had been set on fire." Babington and his other conspirators had run to St. John's Wood, just north of London, and there they hid for 10 days until finally, starved and desperate, they wandered to a nearby town to beg for food. Shortly after, on August 14th, they were arrested and taken to the Tower of London. Babington, like Throckmorton, confessed everything, including Mary, Queen of Scots' direct involvement. though it's important to keep in mind the involvement that he was endorsing and attesting to was actually Walsingham's, not actually Mary's. They, too, were hanged, drawn, and quartered at Tyburn, and Elizabeth this time personally directed their executions to be as grisly and as public as possible. Yikes. So, this takes us to the trial of Mary, Queen of Scots. This is a drawing done by actually one of Walsingham's secretaries, a man named Robert Beale. If you see these 6 figures with their back to us, the 2 in the middle, Walsingham is the leftmost of the 2 in the middle there. So by September of 1586, the gravest plot against Elizabeth had been snuffed out by Walsingham and his diligent network. So what lay in store next was her trial. Following the legislation of 1584 and Mary's involvement, whatever that was, in the Babington Plot, they knew that they were almost there. But Mary had always been so careful. Of all the letters which Walsingham pored over, none were ever in Mary's own hand. They were all by secretaries, all of them one step removed from her actual endorsement. Maybe somebody was just writing in her name. Even with forgeries, this is the best that Walsingham had to work with. Mary's trial took place at Fotheringhay Castle in Northamptonshire from October 12th to October 15th. At the very beginning of these proceedings, Mary attacked the legitimacy of the commission, claiming it had no power to try her as the monarch of another nation. Furthermore, she complained that she was not allowed lawyers and wasn't even allowed to examine the documentary evidence that was being used to try her. The commission responded that it was moot. Babington had confessed her role to the plot. It didn't matter. She did not yet know that her line of communication had been broken. So, when she denied having any involvement with Babington, Walsingham produced her letter that he had sent. At this point, she knew that she had been compromised. She was distraught. She had no idea what was going on. She suspected foul play, and furthermore, she said, quote, "This is all the doing of Monsieur de Walsingham." She turned and asked him bluntly whether he was an honest man who had truly dealt honestly. Walsingham stood, walked directly to the center of the hall, looked Mary Stewart in the eye, and said, quote, "Madam, I am charged by you to have practiced something against you. I call God and all the world to witness. I have done nothing as a private man unworthy of an honest man, nor as a public man unworthy of my calling. I protest before God that as a man careful of my mistress's safety, I have been curious." Mary knew she was caught. Even after everything that we've covered today, after everything that had happened, Elizabeth was still hesitant to try and execute her own cousin. Eventually, though, she was somewhat forced to give in. The commission found that Mary Stewart was guilty of having private knowledge of a plot to usurp and kill the queen, but even so, it was a long way to get Elizabeth to actually order her death. She had signed Mary's death warrant, but refused to actually send the order to have her killed. For some reason, unfathomable to her counselors, she dragged her feet, refusing to send this order, until eventually Walsingham, Cecil, and the other privy councilors could not wait any longer. In February of 1587, without Elizabeth's order, without her permission, without even her knowledge, they sent Mary's death warrant off to Fotheringhay Castle. Mary was beheaded on February 14th, and news of her death would come far before any of the privy councilors told Elizabeth what they had done. She was furious. She very nearly had one of her junior secretaries hanged, drawn, and quartered in public for seditious behavior themselves. And Cecil, her chief advisor, was banished from court for almost 9 months. If not for the eventual coming of the Spanish Armada, I suspect he might have stayed banished forever. But Finally, after all these years, Walsingham had rid Elizabeth of her chief rival. He had quelled this sense of vulnerability for the moment. So I want to talk about very briefly before we do some questions, what are some of the legacies of the story that we've talked about today? Well, there were some immediate legacies. One that I've just alluded to was the Spanish Armada, this very famous event that happens in 1588, just a year after Mary's execution. So when Elizabeth, well, I shouldn't say Elizabeth, when the Privy Councillor under Elizabeth's name killed Mary, they basically had open season on them as a kingdom. All of a sudden, it was fine to depose Elizabeth. She had just killed a monarch. Why could another monarch not kill her? So we could say, in a sense, this really brought on the Spanish Armada, though they weathered the storm. Anti-Catholic sentiment would probably be one of the other lingering hallmarks of this period. This is something that we actually inherited slightly as the United States, an English colony. There was still a very long period of anti-Catholic sentiment lingering in the United States through the 19th century, the 20th century even. So this is a point when what it became to be English was to be Protestant, and the way that England would make its home in the world would be by challenging the Spanish at sea. So in a sense, we could say that the foundation of what it meant to be English, like an English national identity, was really laid in this time period because of the course of events that we just witnessed here. And this, I think, is why we refer sometimes to the Elizabethan era as the Golden Age of Elizabethan England. But I want us to reconsider that to end things here. This is the movie I was talking about earlier. I love Cate Blanchett, and I do love this movie. I have my problems with it as a historian, but Cate Blanchett rocks, so I don't have too many problems. But it really does have a very triumphant feel to it. And what I want us to consider today was what the drive was behind these desperate actions that Walsingham and his colleagues took. I don't think if you asked any of these people in their lives if they thought that they were living through a golden age, I don't think any of them would have said no. I think all of these people were tremendously paranoid and tremendously anxious about what the future of their nation would be. So to the extent that we should really refer to the Elizabethan era as a golden age, we might be removing ourselves from the perspective of the people who actually lived through it. It doesn't mean to say that interesting things didn't happen during this time period. I actually think it becomes more interesting if we think that so much of what happened during the Elizabethan era was driven by paranoia rather than inspiration, I guess you could say, of a different or happier sort. So this is where I want to leave you all today, and this is where I want to remind you all, please, when you come to the Cleveland Museum of Art, one, knock on my door, say hi, hope to see you all there, but also keep what we've talked about in mind when you go through and look at the art. And keep in mind the way that fear and paranoia, vulnerability and insecurity might have been driving these works of art more than anything else. Thank you. Okay, so I think we have, if I can read correctly, like 15 minutes or so, maybe 10 or 15 minutes or so for some questions if we have some. Oh, yes, right in the front here. Oh, I'm sorry, I think we're going to pass around a microphone so everyone can hear questions. My apologies.
Thank you. Going back to your introduction of Walsingham, if I remember correctly, he was reporting basically to Cecil. And I don't know whether we know or not, but to what extent was Elizabeth herself actually involved in the decisions and the background of what Walsingham was doing, or was everything filtered through Cecil?
This is a really great question, and I really, if I had, are you sure you all don't have like 4 more hours for me to talk about William Cecil? I swear it'll be fast. He's an infinitely fascinating figure, and really a figure whose biography is you can't untangle his biography from English history during this time period. His fingerprints are just on everything. So early in his career, especially closer to 1572, I think Walsingham really is reporting directly to William Cecil, and I still think throughout his career he probably is. But we also need to remember that in Elizabeth's court, there's intense factionalism. Walsingham and Cecil are united on this issue of Mary, Queen of Scots, but they have very different ideas as to how England should conduct foreign policy, how England should deal with, revolts in the Netherlands, for example, how anti-Spanish they should be formally, how aggressively anti-Spanish they should be. So these are people that, while they were partners in a sense, they had a really intense disagreement a lot of the time with each other. So it's always hard to say how much Elizabeth was particularly involved, because I think one of the advantages of having, we might almost say, hatchet men like Walsingham was that you don't have to be involved. And she actually really interestingly knew that Walsingham was a bit of a wild card, but she always trusted him because of his religious conviction. She referred to him as someone who basically couldn't change his color no matter how hard that he tried. I think that's actually a quote that she uses about him. And this means that she knew that he would always have the same motive no matter what. So this is why she felt that she could really trust somebody like him, and maybe even trust somebody like him to do things behind her back that she might not want to formally endorse herself. Oh, yes.
Do you think that Elizabeth was the rightful heir to the throne, or should have been Mary, Queen of Scots? And then secondly, is there a book that's quite enjoyable to read on all this that you would recommend?
Oh, absolutely. So to start with your second one, The Watchers by Stephen Alford is absolutely phenomenal. It goes really deep into the actual primary sources. You get to see a lot of the things that we've done here, but he has a really great way of writing in a way that's really, it really does read like a spy novel. And a lot of the figures that we've talked about today will definitely be present there. I'm sorry, could you remind me your first question again? Oh, right. Right. So should Mary, Queen of Scots, have actually been queen? Well, this is actually really depends, and we have to remember who Elizabeth's mother is to answer this question. Elizabeth's mother is Anne Boleyn, the person who's very famously executed for adultery. So in a sense, Elizabeth shouldn't have been queen. She was the daughter of somebody who was executed for a crime against the king himself. So I guess the answer to that question would really fall along religious lines. For Catholics, they thought Mary should have been queen because she was the best Catholic choice. Protestant thought that Elizabeth should be the Protestant queen because she was the best Protestant choice. I think Elizabeth has a more direct claim to the people that came before her. The people that came before her were her father, her brother, her sister, and then Elizabeth. So in a sense, she was more directly related to her predecessors, but it depends on the perspective that you would ask her that question. Is it familial or is it religious that you would want to use to answer that question?
I just thought Elizabeth the first, and then was in Edinburgh this past summer, so it's interesting to hear the difference of
Yeah. Well, and that's exactly the point, is like, it's hard for me. This is always such a dissatisfying answer to give you. It's hard for me to say, I don't know, but that's kind of adds to the whole dimension of what we talked about, is that it's really up in the air, and everyone in the time knew that it was kind of up in the air. You know, Elizabeth was on the throne, but as soon as she's off, she's off. Yeah. Any other questions we might have? Yeah.
Once, some years ago, I saw something on television and about this whole story, and at that time they were posing that Mary was corresponding with her contacts by having a delivery man with a lot of hay and so forth come, and there were letters going back and forth, and that she was accused of having signed something. And then I read about 2 years ago that nobody, the people thought Elizabeth claimed that she had seen it, and that nobody else seems to have seen it, and it cannot be found in the records. Is that really a true story, or did they make it up a bit?
So I think there are kernels of truth to this that always have to be kept in mind. A lot of the primary sources that we have to work with as historians are the copies of letters. So when we deal with, the actual letters themselves that people might have attested to, we have to keep in mind that we're talking about, state secrets and espionage. Walsingham guarded these things incredibly closely, and he destroyed a lot of the evidence that we would talk about after, well, not after his death, but it would be destroyed after his death. So it's very possible that documents like that actually existed. If they did, I would, especially if it was something as incriminating as Elizabeth having a private knowledge that she would then later deny. I would certainly expect that letter to find its way into a fire somehow. But it's entirely possible. And there are, one of the things that makes it hard to know whether this is true or not is the confessions of these people like Throckmorton and Babington were always alleging afterwards that they had been forced into it. They had been tortured into a confession by Walsingham. So how much of this information could really be relied upon is always up in the air. So again, I hate to say I don't know, but I think there's a really, to get back to one of your questions as well, there's a really good book by John Guy called My Heart is My Own. I think it's a biography of Mary, Queen of Scots. And if anybody has, John Guy has poured over, I mean, literally every source that survives that has Mary's writing on it or her name on it. So if there's an answer, it's probably there, I would say. Yeah.
When you put the letter from Mary on the screen, it was hard. I have trouble reading that middle section. Is it in some type of a code or something? I can read the bottom, but...
It is, yeah. So, well, actually, I guess this is a good time for me to tell you all a brief story about when I was a student at Chicago. I had to learn to actually read not only this cipher, but just people's handwriting from the 16th century. And I remember having a discussion with my advisor maybe 7 weeks or so before my thesis was due, and he was like, "Oh yeah, you still have time to learn. You still have time." It's like, "Really, Steve? Are you sure?" Okay, if you think so. So yes, this middle section is a cipher. This is the cipher that Mary, Stewart, and Babington used between each other. So this is actually something I probably should have mentioned at the time. When Walsingham fabricated that postscript, he did so in this cipher that he had cracked. He had a number of really proficient spies working under him. He had a man named Thomas Phillips who was basically a code breaker and linguistic genius. He had another person named Arthur Gregory who was basically employed only because he could reseal envelopes to make it look like they hadn't been opened. So you put those two people together and you can do a lot. So yes, those in the middle would be a cipher. So a lot of the times Walsingham agents would collect these letters. They have no idea what they say, but out of that is suspicion. Yeah. Sure. Yeah, so how have all of these sources, how have these papers not crumbled over the years? I honestly think the same thing about a lot of the pieces at the Cleveland Museum of Art when I walk around. I'm like, how is this jar from 6,000 years ago still here in Cleveland of all places? It's crazy. So a lot of these documents were stored, it strikes me now that this is incredibly ironic. A lot of these documents were actually stored in the Tower of London in the basement for centuries after Elizabeth's reign. And it was only during Victorian times that they were really taken out and this really formal process of history was kind of started. So a lot of them have watermarks all over them. A lot of them are, I mean, they're already borderline illegible if you ask me, but some of them are even like more so borderline illegible. It's, yeah, mold eats away at things. There are, if I had like a quarter for every time there was like a really tantalizing sentence that gets cut off by mold or just like the scrap of paper, it's like, really? Somebody ripped that intentionally, I bet. Oh yeah, another question, yeah.
Quick follow-on question.
Mm-hmm.
Is this in fact paper or is it parchment?
It is parchment, yeah. So that's actually how these things are organized in the National Archives online, is that they'll have like a recto side and then like a folio side of them, so you can tell like which side of the paper it's on. Right, yeah, so it's not actually, so it wouldn't deteriorate as you said, like paper, right? So kind of on the same point, maybe this wouldn't necessarily deteriorate like paper would deteriorate. We would expect it to because it's more parchment, which is like an animal skin, so maybe it would last a little longer then. Absolutely. Any other questions we might have? Oh yeah, absolutely.
I apologize because I haven't been to the exhibit yet, but we're going.
Oh, you got to come for a tour. I'll be there.
I have a very basic question. I have a hard time between Mary Stewart and Mary Tudor. Could you explain the difference?
Sure. So I should have a better way of remembering them as an aspiring professional historian, but I always remember Mary Tudor as Bloody Mary. That's just the easiest way for me to remember it. And whether that's because of the name or the drink, I will let you all decide. But Mary Tudor was Elizabeth's half-sister who came before her. Mary Stewart would have, by association, would have also been Mary Tudor's cousin as well. But Mary Tudor was the daughter of Henry VIII, where Mary Stewart was the daughter of James V of Scotland. So Mary's parents were Scottish. Mary Stuart's parents were Scottish. Mary Tudor's parents were English, actually English and Spanish. But they were kind of contemporary. Again, this is one of the hardest parts about doing history in this time period, is that every man is named John and Francis and William, and it's like Williams and Elizabeths and Marys across the board. So it admittedly does get like difficult to keep these figures straight. But Mary Stuart was never actually Queen of England. She was a pretender to one, or I guess we could say a claimant to one, where Mary Tudor actually had been queen before Elizabeth. And Elizabeth inherited Mary Tudor's Catholic England, basically, which is why she felt it so necessary to settle the religious scene when she ascended to the throne.
So she was Catholic, Mary Tudor was Catholic.
Yes, both of them were Catholic, if that makes it more complicated or easier.
Even though Henry VIII was her father, she was still Catholic.
Yes, this is a kind of an interesting point. There's another, oh my gosh, I'm blanking on the title of this book, but it's by a historian named Eamon Duffy, who basically has kind of done a revisionist history of the Reformation in England. And he noted that during Mary Tudor, again, this is Elizabeth's predecessor, the Catholic predecessor, during this time that she reverted England back to Catholicism, all of a sudden, all these relics that had been hidden, disappeared for years during the Reformation, all these Catholic things just started coming out of the woodwork as if people had been hiding them very successfully for almost 20 years or so. So it's important maybe to keep in mind that the English Reformation, because of Henry VIII, is really a top-down affair. It's imposed on people rather than bottom-up like Luther's Reformation on the continent was. So this means that it's already hard enough to change the religion of a nation in 30 years. It's even harder when you're making people do it rather than them asking for it themselves. So all these sorts of Catholic things just start coming out of the woodwork when Catholicism is restored. And England, Elizabeth's advisors knew that. They saw that happen and they thought, this is still a very Catholic country. It might not be inaccurate to say that England was a Protestant nation nominally under Elizabeth, but if you were to take it by what the actual faith of the people in the country, it might have still been a Catholic country. Oh, I think we have a question in the back.
The divine right of kings. What point does that start to get shaky?
So this is actually kind of interestingly where people start to make the question was about like the divine right of kings. When does the divine right of kings start to come into play? This had always been a lingering thing. I mean, monarchs had always been anointed with this sort of holy oil that they would call christened. So there was always this sort of divine component to kingship in the medieval period and the early modern period. But it's actually at this juncture that you see people making more aggressive claims to like the divine right of kingship. Louis XIV of France, who would come very soon after this, would really be like the first person to make this very aggressive claim. And it kind of, I would say, it coincides to when nations can actually start to administer themselves more from a center. They can actually federalize in a way that they haven't before, and then you can actually make the claim to divine right of kingship a little more strong. So I think right about this time period, this really starts to take off as an idea. And I would also add, maybe for the same reason we talked about today, there might not be a need to say this, you have this divine right of kingship if you feel really secure in your throne. Any other questions? Oh, yeah.
Do I remember correctly, drop back 30 years, drop back 30 years. Do I remember correctly that Henry VIII and the entire country were, I've lost the word, the Pope threw them out of the.
Excommunicated.
Excommunicated.
Yes,
Thank you.
yes, yes.
Thank you.
So,
Sorry, senior moment
oh,
there.
please, no.
Yeah. So, England was actually excommunicated twice during this period.
Yeah. It's an interesting question because one of the questions I always have is why did it take so long for the Pope to excommunicate Elizabeth? And the same thing happens with Henry. Why did it take so long for the Pope to excommunicate Henry, though eventually he did? It's kind of interesting. Henry VIII's Reformation, his break from Catholicism, was almost entirely jurisdictional. There really is no change in theology between Henry VIII's Church of England and the Catholic Church. Henry is really he doesn't want any sort of authority above himself in his own kingdom. That includes the Pope. And this is really just a line that he draws here. So with that in mind, the Pope at the time and subsequent popes really thought that with ritual so much the same, with theology so much the same, that excommunication was kind of the nuclear option that didn't necessarily have to be dropped until things got to a point of no return. So it took a while for Henry to be excommunicated, though he was. And it also took a while for Elizabeth to excommunicated, though, again, she was. But you're right, yes. So there were 2 monarchs that were excommunicated in England.
Elizabeth was excommunicated after the Book of Common Prayer?
Yes, by... Actually, it's very close. I want to say the Book of Common Prayer is the mid-1550s under Cranmer, I believe. Maybe even a little bit earlier under the Edwardian period. But right. Right, absolutely. Yeah, the Book of Common Prayer is like this. So the Book of Common Prayer is actually where we get a lot of the sayings that we have in weddings, like in sickness and in health. This is like kind of like the playbook for Protestantism, as it were, like how you would be a good Protestant. And this was a very useful thing for everyone in a new Protestant nation to be able to use, right? You have this book, it tells you what to do from the old version. So this was incredibly useful to Elizabeth, these sorts of, a different type of propaganda, really. This is, we're verging on the relationship between like art and literature now, but this is, so the Book of Common Prayer, very important to this. Yeah, plus it's in English finally, right? Yeah, no more Latin.
All right, well, we can wrap it up because you can ask Reggie any lingering questions. We've got cookies and coffee, so join us, and let's give one more round of applause for Reggie.
Thank you.